So that video Adam just shared, he made that video about 2 years ago because I decided I was going to do this sermon series. And so it kind of got put on hold. So he was fully prepared 2 years ago with that video, but we just didn't show that until now. We are getting into a new sermon series, and we're going to take this kind of through just past, through most of June, called The Names of God. And we're going to look at some of these names that they use in the Hebrew language to describe attributes of God and who God was. And so we're going to we'll be a little out of order when we go through these series, but we're going to start in the beginning. And we are going to start in the beginning today. It's going to be in Genesis. So we're going to start in the beginning, and we're going to look at some of these names that they used to describe who God was and how he interacted with them and some of these attributes. And so today we're going to start with Elohim. And part of the reason why I decided to come back to this sermon series is I was reading a book recently, one of those books that I had on my shelf that I've wanted to read for a while. And since I'm currently not in class, it's kind of the point of time where I can start reading the books that I want to read instead of just being reading all the books that I have to read for class. And one of these books, the book that I started reading was called Reclaiming the Great Commission. And it's really talking about what the church was and what the church is supposed to be in this reclaiming of our Great Commission. And then in the beginning, the first couple chapters, the authors talk about the world ultimately trying to figure out the reasons why, or trying to just feeling like there's a void in their life and trying to fill that void with all those things. We've heard this before. And they kind of come around to this, set this up. And because the world desires a relationship with the Creator, even though most of the world don't understand that that's what the void that they're trying to fill, that we understand as Christians that part of that feeling that we had before Christianity was that we didn't have a relationship with the Creator, and that starts to, when we develop that relationship with the Creator, those desires, that desire to fill that void tends to go away. And I realized that this whole concept of a lot of this that we wrestle with before we become Christians, or even after we become Christians, is this bigger question of why. I come to realize that ultimately there's a longing to know more as a human is a human thing, not necessarily a Christian thing, right? And ultimately, because even those that aren't Christians have this desire to know more, right? And ultimately, as a Christian, part of our desire to know more is to know God more, to learn more about God and who He is and what He has planned for us. And so as we think about all these things, that's part of why I came back to this. I think we should start in through this names of God. As we learn more things about God, as we develop this picture of who God is, God has been, who He is, and who He will be, right? God becomes this very real being. Or sometimes we talk about God being a person as in a person of the Trinity, right? Not understanding that God is not a human like us, but a person. But God becomes this very real being. Sometimes especially when we first become a Christian, or maybe if we haven't learned a whole lot about who God is, or if we haven't really gone through classes, or if we haven't really gone to church, we might think that God is a little standoffish to us. Because God is God, absolutely. I'm not denying that. But God is so much more than we could ever imagine. And I will say, like in the very beginning of this, that the English language cannot capture who God is, right? Like we can't capture in our faulty human language who God is because he's so much more. So the question of why and coming to God, to know God more, isn't a new thing. This isn't just something that our generation is trying to figure out. There have been questions from the beginning. There were questions that were attempted to be answered from the beginning. And from the beginning is where we're starting today, right? I feel to understand the different dimensions of God, we need to understand and start to see what names the Israelites called them, what they said about God. And so I wanted to start us out. We're going to start out in Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2 today. That's all we're going to do. Because in the beginning, when the scribes wrote down this story, this is how they described God in the beginning. So let's read Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Let's take that verse by verse. In the beginning, God created, and the word that they use here for God is Elohim. Adam, did I have that highlighted? No, I didn't. Sorry. Elohim. Elohim means God or gods or divine being or judges. Elohim is kind of an all-encompassing name for God. Now, the Israelites, obviously, we're talking about God, not gods or divine beings, right? But God, or Elohim, is kind of one of those words like mom, right? So you could talk about your mom, like mom specifically. If you were with your siblings and you say mom, it would be, you would most likely believe that it was your mom, right? Not some other person's mom. So it's kind of, Elohim is this all-encompassing word. But we can believe, because of what they say, that the Israelites are saying, in the beginning, God. So God, the God that created. In the beginning, God, Elohim. Now, the beginning of this word, El, in Elohim, El, when you see that in the biblical text, or, well, if you hear that, sometimes you might hear someone call God by one of those names, El. The El part of that word, if you say just that part of the word, it is specifically just God. And so we see these in different places. You might have heard someone call God El Roy. I did highlight that one. Which means the God who sees. When Hagar runs away and she is under the bush, right, under the tree, and her son is dying, she says God is El Roy, the God who sees. She gives this name to God, the God who sees, El Roy. You may have heard of Elohim, which is different. And that means the everlasting God. Sometimes just in our English, we use just that term, the everlasting God. This term is used a lot in the book of Isaiah. And then, drum roll please, one that we might remember because of a song that was sung in the 90s, El Shaddai, right? You guys maybe remember this one? It means God Almighty. God calls himself this when he's speaking to Abram in Genesis 17. Some of us remember that name just because of the Amy Grant song, El Shaddai, El Shaddai. You guys remember it? Yep. Okay. Now, there are different names used within the biblical text, even within the same book. In Genesis, as we said, as you may have already understood, there are different names that are used. So in Genesis chapter 1, we have Elohim, and in chapter 2, he's called something different, which we will get to next week. All these names describe different aspects of who God is. And in this first verse of Genesis, those that are scribing it down, those who originally spoke this into existence, they are saying, in the beginning, Elohim bara. So God created. And this bara is a creation out of nothing. Out of nothing. So they are saying the Creator God created out of nothing the heavens and the earth. Even before there was anything, there was God. And He created. He was the Creator. They're saying in this verse, Elohim, the God who created the heavens and earth. And then on to verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Right? He created the heavens. He created the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And the ruach, I can't roll my R's, so that's the R in ruach gets a roll, but it's not there. The ruach of Elohim was hovering over the waters. In these two sentences, the author is laying down some very solid theological truths in who God is. God is the Creator. And the Spirit of God, the Ruach of Elohim, was hovering over the water. In the beginning, God, Elohim, created in an instant out of nothing. When there was nothing else, there was God, or there was Elohim, or the Ruach of Elohim, the Spirit of God. God is the Creator. God, and as I talk about this, I want to reiterate, as we're talking about these different names and the different aspects of who God is God. And I'm not denying that. I'm not trying to make us believe God is someone different than what He is. I'm just trying to give us a more dimensional picture of who God is. And in these verses, we read that God is the Creator. That before there was anything, there was God. And God was the Creator, and the Spirit of God was hovering over. Sometimes we get very stuck on different aspects of who God is, and we may have a very one-dimensional picture of who God is. And we don't really pay attention to the different aspects of who God is. But God isn't just this one-dimensional being. God is so much more than that. We, in a common language, use one name, God, right? In English, we call Him God, which isn't a bad thing, but we need to remember, in the grand scheme of things, there are different aspects to this word. There are different dimensions to who God is. And to kind of pull this all back, there are a lot of people in this world that are trying to answer who God is in their lives, believers and non-believers all the same. Part of living the life that we are called to live as Christians is living those different aspects of who God is. And so to live that out, we have to start to understand who God is. Farther into Genesis, we see that God creates man and woman, and He says we're going to create them in our image, in the image of God. Ultimately, why? Why were we created in the image of God? Why are we created in that image? Maybe that's to reflect God's image into this world. Now, sometimes that image that we were created in gets marred in sin. But ultimately, we don't have to choose to live that way, right? We can fully step into the life that God has for us. We don't have to live out the marred life that sometimes people say that we have to. We don't have to do that. We believe that God is more than just us sitting here and suffering on earth, that we can have a better life than that. And I know that I've said this before, but when we truly understand who God is, that is life-changing. I haven't finished the book. I just started it this probably about 3 days ago. But the one thing that this book has brought up so far, so many times, is how impersonal we as a church, and I'm talking about churches in general, not necessarily just our church, but the broader term church, how impersonal we as a church make God. We tend to hold him at a distance. We tend to be standoffish with God sometimes. We give the Sunday school answers. We go through the motions. We check off the checklist. But that isn't what we are called to do. We should have a heart knowledge of who God is, so that when people ask us a simple question of who God is, we can give them a personal answer. This isn't just recited from a book. It isn't just a Sunday school answer. It's a deeply personal answer. This answer to the question, who is God? Because the world is looking for answers. And we can't give impersonal answers and expect them to accept who God is just by a dictionary definition of who God is. And it's at that point, when you come to know who God is, that you realize that God is all of these things and more. That God is the God who sees. God is the God who created. God is everlasting. God isn't just a being who's impersonal, but a being who's very personal. And we no longer, at that point, when we realize who God is, we realize that we can no longer hold him at a distance. That there is nothing that we can hide. Nothing that we will just tuck away and maybe he won't see this. Maybe we'll keep this a secret. When we realize who God is, we will come to realize that God loves us. Even these things that we want to try to hide from him, he's not afraid of. And he loves us, and he wants better for us. But he loves us. As a Christian, our actions, our words, our attitudes all reflect who he is. He is love in the purest form. He is holy love. And that's what we're called to be. That's how we're called to live. When we, as Christians, come to realize who God is and reflect that back into the world, when we reflect back into God's creation, then beautiful things are going to happen. When we reflect back who God is, this holy love into creation, when we reflect that back with our actions, our attitudes, our what we say, what our mind thinks, then beautiful things will happen. We weren't created to reflect hate back onto a world that hates. We were created to reflect holy love back onto a world because it's vastly different than what the world is. As Christians, we can't make God impersonal because that's the last thing that God is impersonal. God is very personal. We should reflect that in our very being. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have reverence for God, because there is a reverence in that. I'm saying this just because I don't want anybody to think that I think otherwise. But God should be someone who's so personal to us. And as we go through the series, we're going to go through, I want us to think of this question. This question that might get answered to us at some point, or maybe it has gotten asked of us at some point. This question of who is God? If someone asked us that question today, what would our answer be? Would we give, if a non-believer asked us, would we give the Sunday school answer as to who God is? Or would we give a more personal answer of who God is, what God has done in our lives? Can we answer this question? It seems like a simple question. But can we answer it? No. Once again, I understand that human words come up empty when we try to answer this question of who God is. But I believe that we can know him so intimately and so deeply that when people ask this question of us, that we have an instant answer. That doesn't make an impersonal God. But maybe we don't have an answer yet, and that's okay. Maybe we've grown up in the church most of our lives, and we're just starting to come to realize who God is because he's just starting to become personal to us. If we don't have an answer to this question, or even if we do, I challenge you guys to at least listen online if you're not here for the next couple weeks, because I've been praying that this will help us to understand who God is. We can sing our praises to him, we can pray to him, but if we don't ultimately have an understanding of who he is, then what are we spreading out in this world? Because when we know who he is, then, like I said, this becomes personal. We're going to talk about in the next few weeks a few different aspects of who God is, what the Israelites called God in the Hebrew text. But as I said, I want this question to be on our mind for the next few weeks. Who is God? And I pray that we will have deep, meaningful experiences with God to where maybe if we didn't have an answer to that question before, that we can answer that question after these next few weeks. Seems like a simple question. It really does. But there's a lot that goes into this. And I pray we as a church can not only understand this question, answer this question, who is God, but that we can reflect that into the world. Because that's what this world needs, is holy love. Is a church that acts like a church. I'm not trying to get down on our church. I'm just saying church in general. Who is God? Who is he to you? What has he done? What have you seen him do in the lives of those around you? Who is God? I'm going to leave us on that question. I know. Kind of a hard one. We're going to sing the song, Lord, I Need You. As I don't know about you guys, but when I think about this question, who is God? God is the very breath in my body, the very reason for living, because I need him every moment of my life. So let's sing, Lord, I Need You.